Hello, I'm Anwultus, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about China, especially in regards to what I had said previously with Stephen Ignoramus and Carl Emmerich when we were discussing Donald Trump's second term agenda in regards to the potential for war against China and the necessity of war against China. So, in that sense, I want to clarify my position very much just so that there's no confusion whatsoever in regards to my exact position on this. So, first of all, I want to say that I am generally not a hawkish person. In other words, if there is a situation where we just say, oh, there's an opportunity for war, I'm not all in for taking that opportunity necessarily. But what I do think is that war is a useful tool in certain situations, and one of them would be in the case of the overthrow of your country by foreign powers through various means. War is an, a useful solution to that problem. So, in other words, I'm not into the idea of going to war to spread democracy or various values. I'm more into fighting war for realistic reasons. That is to say, defensively, obviously. I don't think that there's very many people that would disagree on fighting defensive wars, but also strategically. And when I say strategically, I think I need to be very clear that there are certain types of strategic advantages and disadvantages uh, that a country can get into. And in order to overcome them, sometimes war is necessary, especially if the other side of whatever issue this is also arming up and getting ready for war. Now, in regards to China, I don't think that we can really say that China hasn't aggressed in some way. I'm sure that there's probably quite a lot of different ways in which China has aggressed towards the U.S. Outside of course, direct military conflict. In the same way, it's possible to also say that the U.S. has already done that towards China. So, in other words, we could say that there's a current Cold War already going on, and there are casus belli on both sides. And in that sense, going to a hot war wouldn't be unreasonable in the sense of violating any principle of non-aggression. In other words, there's already been quite a lot of aggression on both sides, even if it hasn't directly been military. So we can always go to war based on these past grievances. So what I am saying is, once again, I'm not in favor of declaring war when the other side hasn't aggressed in some way, and I think that China has aggressed quite frequently, and the U.S. has been very lenient on China. A big example would be the Korean War, where in the late stages of the Korean War, large numbers of Chinese forces fought on the side of North Korea, and ultimately, against the advice of General MacArthur, the U.S. decided not to launch a major counteroffensive into China. Um, of course, there was the potential of having a World War III at that time, and that was viewed very unfavorably, especially in light of the economic situation, among other things. So I understand why they didn't do it, and I think from a strategic perspective, it can be justified that they didn't do it. But nevertheless, there's a grievance that remains there. Similar things can be said about the situation with Chinese hackers, which recently, I believe, the wording has occurred from government sources that are not referring to them by their country of origin, but actually by their association with the actual Chinese government. So, in that sense, there's a grievance there that I think could be a bellicose. What is the term? I would say actionable offense, but that's a legal term. A bellicable offense. There you go. In other words, an aggression has been made that you could declare war over. So, and people might say, well, hacking is a sort of minor thing. I disagree. Um, Hacking can cause major problems. So, if there's a government out there that's supporting covert ops and cyber ops against our country, and they haven't declared war, we can say that we're at the very least in a stage where aggressions have been made. And of course, I will say that the US is not innocent in this. The US does things like this all the time. For example, in the US's support of the Hong Kong protests, which in some ways has emboldened the protests to the point where they've squandered their liberty, and now China has taken them down. Although, once again, I'm not saying that the war would be necessarily to restore democracy to the Chinese mainland or to end the genocide of minorities in China, although that would be likely a consequence of the war. In other words, I'm not saying this specifically to interfere with the internal affairs of China. However, I am saying this that it is important for our external affairs that China is dealt with. And that's where the idea of a Thucydides trap comes in. And what is a Thucydides trap? A Thucydides trap is the idea that if there is one dominant power in a region, and that would be the US. The US has a lot of bases off the shore of China, etc., dating back to the end of World War II and the Cold War. And then there's an emerging power, in this case, China. And in the case of China, China is also trying to establish bases on the sea, and that's what we see in the South China Sea. But if you think about it, what country in the South China Sea really could challenge China in a direct conflict? It's obviously not going to be Malaysia. It's not going to be the Philippines. It's not going to be Vietnam. It's none of those countries. The only major country that would challenge China is the US. So in that sense, it's obvious who they're doing this in defense over for. So it is a sort of strategic maneuvering in order to get into an advantageous position. Sort of like if you play board games, the game Go, where the goal isn't, it's different from chess where you directly attack the opponent's pieces. In the game Go, you surround the opponent's pieces, and that's how you capture them. And so it's very important to get strategic positioning of various pieces as you're placing pieces on the board until you finally have the overall advantage, and that's where you can end the game. Now, China's primary concern currently is dealing with India, and we can see this in the way that China is leasing ports, and the positioning of those tends to be in a direction that tries to steer away shipping from Indian ports. And it also allows China to have military bases in that area. And of course, China isn't on the friendliest of terms with India, despite the Belt and Road Initiative, which goes through India. Um, with recent conflict on the Indian-Chinese border, there's a potential for escalation, although I don't think either side really is interested in a war. And that's the thing about these strategic, these games of grand strategy that countries play. It's that war isn't the goal of anything, really. Nobody wants to go to war specifically unless they're looking to directly loot something that the other people have. What war is a tool, usually a tool of last resort. Now, the problem here is that this implies, of course, that China doesn't want to declare war on the US, and it's not going to unless the US does something that directly flies in the face of what China is doing. And in this stage, the US can probably get away with quite a bit of things without having China declare war on the US. And that's why we see things like I don't think Iran has a declaration of war against the US despite the killing of Soleimani. So in that sense, you see that weaker powers generally don't have an advantage in declaring war, and therefore they generally try not to. Now, the U.S. in its foreign policy has been largely idealistic rather than realistic, at least since Woodrow Wilson. So in that sense, I think that I generally don't like this approach of we're going to bring democracy to the world. Not that I'm opposed to democracy, but I just don't think that democracy is a moral necessity that everybody should have. I don't think that's true. And as a Christian, I am I'm in favor of not an absolute democracy at the end state, but an autocracy, the kingdom of God. So in that sense, I don't see democracy as a virtue in itself. I see democracy as a useful tool for governing countries if it is organized properly. Because if it's not organized properly, then it doesn't actually work very well, and that's where you see a lot of corruption, you see lobbying, and problems there. Now, in the case of China, why did I say that waging a war against China as soon as possible, that is to say, within the next presidential term, is better than waiting until later? Well, the reason for that is that currently the US has a strong strategic advantage against China in a number of different ways. And however, China is one of the most resourceful countries in the world, and if China's economy continues to develop, and if China's military continues to develop as China is developing its military, eventually these advantages will disappear. And first, they'll disappear regionally. First, we'll lose our regional advantage against China. Then, we'll lose our global advantage against China. Now, that depends on how far China is going. So, people talking about the Thucydides trap might ask, why why wasn't there a major war between Britain and the US? Why did the US and the UK not go to a major war if the US was an emerging power and if Britain was a dominant power? Well, the fact is that Britain was already at war with another emerging power, that the US had had some minor conflicts in the Pacific, and that is Germany. And France also had had a war. France, which at the time was one of the dominant continental powers in Europe, had a war with Germany, the Franco-Prussian War. And so, in that sense, World War One, which resulted from a number of different rivalries, the rivalry between Austria and Russia when it concerns the Balkans, the rivalry between Austria and Italy, the rivalry between Germany and France, and the emerging rivalry between Germany and the UK. World War One, in essence, weakened all of the continental European powers, so that the US's economic recovery following World War One was much more significant and greater than that of Britain, to the point that the US began getting ahead economically. Now, at this point, the US still considered a, a war, at least a naval war, uh, against Britain as a possibility. So there were war games. Not that the US intended to go to war with Britain, or that Britain intended to go to war with the US. They simply regarded it as a possibility. So Britain and Japan were the primary opponents in naval war games in, I believe, the Naval War College or something like that, where each class would have their own iteration of these naval war games. And that eventually bore fruit in World War II, where the admirals and captains, etc., in the Navy, the U.S. Navy, used these war games as a bit of a sort of predictive experience as to how war in the Pacific would be. Now, of course, things had changed a lot. Obviously, war games done in the 20s would be different than ones done in the 30s, because technology advanced, airplanes became a lot more important, and you begin seeing carriers and such things. So, in that sense, you see that happening. But speaking about Japan in that sense, the war in the Pacific, you can see this Thucydides trap and emerging power situation happening with Japan and the US in the Pacific, because the US controlled the Philippines and a number of territories, uh, all the way up to Hawaii and Midway, and Japan had taken control of some former German colonies, and the U.S. had actually had conflict with Germany before World War One in the Pacific. I think there was the Samoan crisis, for example. So in that sense, the Pacific was sort of already in a state of primary influence by the US and the UK and Japan. And Japan, as an emerging power, eventually saw the the presence of the US in the in the Western Pacific to be a problem, and eventually that led to Pearl Harbor and other things. Now, the U.S. at that point was already supporting Britain with Lend-Lease, and the U.S. had stopped sending or had stopped selling supplies to Japan in a number of different ways. So the U.S. was already picking its winners in the European War, and in doing so, the U.S. antagonized Japan, that was fighting in the Pacific. Um, so that obviously led to a situation where there was already antagonism, although I don't think you could call that aggression in any direct sense. But Japan, as an emerging power, eventually saw it necessary to attack the US. And that's the sort of springing of the Thucydides trap, in a way. But again, as I said, the UK in World War One and in World War Two weakened significantly. A lot of their colonies had independence movements, and the eventual collapse of the British, both economically, and later on imperially, compared to the US's economic rise and then later on rise to hegemony following World War II, it happened at the same time, and the adversaries that the UK was fighting were weakening the UK to a point where it wasn't necessary for any major war to happen there. And also, the US and the UK had separate spheres of influence largely before the US became a more global leader following World War II. So, in that sense, the US wasn't directly interfering with British interests because the US wasn't really interested in expanding its sphere of influence. So the US had sort of capped itself to a point, and you can call that a type of isolationism. So in that sense, that's why the US and the UK didn't go to war. Now, in the sense of fighting the war early, I'm getting back to that idea. The reason why we fight early is not only because we have an advantage, but by having an advantage against China militarily, we can actually determine the extent of the war. And what I mean by that is that by having superiority both navally and in the air, the US, and maybe even in space, but I don't think China is involved on that level anyway, so it doesn't really matter at this point. So, but by having naval and air superiority, the US can essentially, as I said in the discussion, fight as the away team. In other words, the majority of Chinese attacks are going to be against military targets that are immediately close to China. China doesn't have military bases right off the American coast. So in that, but the US has military bases off the Chinese coast. So that really tells you that obviously there might be long range missiles, and that's where missile defense comes in, but it's a lot easier to defend against long range missiles than it is to defend against short range missiles because there's more time to identify the threat and to intercept it, which you don't have if the missiles are short range. But anyway, by using strategic attacks against Chinese naval targets, airstrips, and missile sites, the US can create a situation where the Chinese essentially are on the back foot and can't really react against the US unless the US wants to give China the opportunity to react. In other words, the amount of forces that the US has to deploy is limited in that sense because the US will be able to determine the field of conflict, which limits the conflict. Now, if China and US fought on equal terms, let's say 50 years down the line, if the CCP is still in power and China and the US fight on equal terms, you have a situation where you can actually have a total war as opposed to a limited war, where both sides have the ability to deploy more and where supremacy in mediums of travel are not acquired, and that leads to a much more protracted and much more intense long war. So what I'm saying is that by declaring war as soon as possible, we actually limit the casualties significantly. That's what I'm saying. We limit casualties on both sides significantly. Now, obviously, since the US has the advantage, there will be heavier casualties on the Chinese side. But by having a war as soon as possible, we limit the casualties on both sides. We don't have to go to a total war. and we ultimately have a guaranteed advantage. So I'm not the only one that's saying that would have an advantage. Um, that's why China is building up, because they don't want the US to have an advantage over them, and India to have an advantage, although I don't think India has a massive advantage over China. Not in any direct sense. Uh, but I guess I would point to, as an analysis of this, Binkov's Battlegrounds made a video on a potential war between U.S. and China, but that was based on the number of troops immediately present in the area, and the idea is, if I remember correctly, that China would have some advantages if let's say the war broke out today and people immediately started firing on each other. China would have some advantages, but would ultimately not be able to gain the strategic superiority, because the US not only has a lot of resources in the area next to China, which is only a portion of US resources, but also because the US would be able to bring in a lot of resources from various areas. And therefore, the US has the ability to protect its own supply lines a lot better than China has the ability to project its own supply lines. The US has a greater ability to project force on a global scale, which China does not have, and which is something that China is trying to achieve. So, in that sense, I don't really see a disadvantage in fighting now. Now, obviously, it wouldn't be right away. Obviously, we might need a year to mobilize, and obviously, China would know that we're mobilizing, so they'd have mobilized too. But I think even if both countries mobilized, um, China would still be at a disadvantage, which is how you want to fight a battle. You never want a fair fight in a war. A fair fight is something that you should avoid, um, unless the only alternative is to fight at a disadvantage, at least in symmetrical conflicts. So if you're fighting symmetrically, that is, you're fighting with conventional methods, all above board, and you're not using guerrillas and covert ops. Uh, you want to fight at as much of an advantage as possible. So if we are going to fight against China eventually, we should fight sooner rather than later, because in the short term we have the advantage, but in the long term China may have the advantage. Now, that being said, is the war completely unavoidable? Is there some way in which we could avoid the war? Yes, there's probably a few different ways. One, we can choose to not fight at all, which means that we essentially end up being at a huge strategic disadvantage in the long term. And by the time people actually want to fight against China, we'll be at a stage where we can't fight against China uh, in on equal terms or successfully. So we can wait for that to happen. Uh, Another thing that could happen is if China has a government change, or they change their foreign policy significantly to not be as aggressive or expansionist, uh, then we might not have to go to war, because then China wouldn't really be threatening U.S. strategic interests. Um, Now, you might say, well, why China and not Russia? Well, the reason is that Russia is already surrounded, which is one of Russia's primary policy goals, is to uh, escape the encirclement that the U.S. had placed on the Soviet Union and later on Russia. So that's why there's opposing support in Syria, and Iran. It's because Russia is trying to break its encirclement. If you look at the alliance networks of the US, maybe I can show a map of this. What you see is that the US subsidizes most militaries in the world, and you can see that a lot of uh, Americans' strongest allies are surrounding Russia. So you've got Canada, you have NATO. Well, Canada is part of NATO, so the rest of NATO. But I wanted to point out Canada specifically because looking at maps, people might not think about the North Pole angle. Japan on the other side, South Korea. So in that sense, Russia is largely surrounded. You might say that China is sort of breaking that encirclement, but China and Russia's foreign policy interests are not in line. Um, so in that sense, China and Russia wouldn't be easy allies. And speaking about alliances, what about China allying with other countries? So China allying with Russia. Would China with Russia lead to them being able to win this war potentially, the US-Chinese war? In other words, would this expand into a global conflict? Is what I'm asking in general, or is what I'm being asked by the hypothetical questionnaire. I don't think that China would gain an advantage in allying with Russia. It would be mildly advantageous, but I don't think it would be advantageous enough to win a war against the US. Because if China allies with Russia, then you might get the whole NATO angle going, and it's not a war, not a simple war between the US and the People's Republic of China. I need to be sure to make that clear because this is important in the aftermath. Now, if there is a risk, if Russia is leaning into the risk, maybe we can say that we'll get out of Syria and we won't mess around with Iran as much. And then maybe they'll throw Russia a bone in the Middle East, and Russia might not be as eager to join China because the US has done a friendly gesture. So you could say by making some minor concessions in the Middle East, we can avoid Russia joining China. But I don't think Russia would join China anyway, because currently, even if they were to both fight together, they wouldn't win. That's how powerful the US and its own system of alliances is. Now, Africa, there's no country in Africa that would join China in a war. A lot of people say that talking about China's activity in Africa is a bit of a red herring because India and Southeast Asia is a lot more immediately important in regards to China's ambitions. So, although there's a lot of economic support for countries in Africa coming out of China, but similar thing is coming out of the US, perhaps to maybe not to the same extent, but the US is definitely subsidizing the militaries of most countries in Africa. So it doesn't really make sense for countries in Africa to want to join China in a war, especially since China is so far away and doesn't really have the power to project force to the point that if the US were to focus on a country in Africa, China wouldn't be able to go in and defend them. So in that sense, an alliance with countries in Africa wouldn't make sense for China, and it wouldn't make sense for those countries in Africa. Vietnam hasn't always been on the best of terms with China, and I don't think Vietnam would risk being destroyed as a country by joining China in a war like this. Similar with North Korea. North Korea doesn't really have anything to gain by this war, especially if China can't win it. And North Korea, by joining the war, would very much have a high likelihood of being wiped off the map. So it doesn't make sense for the foreign policy interests of North Korea. Now, of course, depending on the military leadership of North Korea, they might decide that it's maybe the now or never turning point, that if China gets taken out, that North Korea will not be able to remain an independent country and that they'll have to fight, in which case I guess that's an opportunity to get rid of North Korea. But again, they don't have a potential to win if North Korea joins. Um, Nepal, a lot of people don't think about Nepal, but Nepal is a more socialist country at least currently, and has decent ties with China. But Nepal doesn't really have any reason to fight a war with China, so I don't really see that as being something that would happen. India is not a friend of China. India was trying to get friendly with China, but then the recent border conflict happened. If anything, India would probably be a potential ally in a war against China. Although the likelihood of India wanting to join a war if the U.S. is getting started if the U.S. is starting it, is unlikely. Um, Taiwan, or the Republic of China as it's called, can be another way to legitimate a war against China, because what we can say is that we recognize the Republic of China as the legitimate Chinese government, and we make an alliance, and we're going to support them against their rebels in the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party. Um, so in that sense, you could frame it that way, although that's a sort of roundabout and silly way of framing it, rather than simply saying, well, it's for strategic interests, and we're going to have a war anyway, so we might as well get it over with. And there's already a non-open conflict between China and the U.S., so we might as well take the advantages that we have and push them to their limit. So, but Taiwan maybe isn't going to fight directly in the war, but Taiwan can be a useful country for the aftermath. So before I talk about the aftermath, nuclear war, the potential for nuclear war. Now, I don't think that there's any nuclear missile silo in the world that the U.S. intelligence doesn't know the location of, or at least there shouldn't be. At least since the usage of global satellite imagery, I don't think that there's likely to be such a thing that the U.S. wouldn't be aware of. So by using the U.S.'s air advantage, the U.S. might be able to take out nuclear missile silos, or we can just simply have a gentleman's agreement not to use nuclear weapons. That would work too. And China doesn't really have a reason to, doesn't have much to gain from using nuclear weapons against the US, because you might say that obviously military bases that are close to China might be targets, but all in all, the China doesn't really have a way to gain a massive advantage by using nuclear weapons, because the US has mobile naval forces, so sitting military bases might not be the best of targets. And people might say, well, what if China launches an ICBM and it hits somewhere in the actual states? Well, China wouldn't be able to press any advantage from that. And if anything, that would likely increase the war fervor in the US, because China isn't able to press the advantages of using such weapons, while the US would be able to press the advantages of using nuclear weapons in China. So what we can do is we can have a gentleman's agreement that we either don't use nuclear weapons and we fight conventionally, or we do use nuclear weapons, and in the case that we do, would have a massive advantage, because we're actually able to press strategic advantages from using the nuclear weapons, which China at its current state does not have the potential to do that. So what I am saying is that we can choose not to go nuclear, and if both sides choose not to go nuclear, then that's fine. And it's not as if this hasn't happened before. Countries uh, with nuclear weapons have had minor conflicts before. There's been minor conflicts between uh, China and the Soviet Union, minor conflicts between India and Pakistan, minor conflicts between India and China. There's Israel has nuclear weapons, and they're not nuking the Palestinians. So what I am saying is people are capable of holding restraint, and what we'll say is that whoever uses it first legitimizes the use, and we're able to take out Chinese missile sites a lot easier than they're able to take out American missile sites. So ultimately, we'd have the advantage, and I don't think they'd want to introduce such a factor because let's just say that if we wanted to use nuclear weapons in a lot in a more liberal way, we could really put continental China at a massive disadvantage. Um, so you've never seen nuclear carpet bombing, but that is a potential strategy. I think MacArthur had this idea to create a sort of nuclear wasteland, no man's zone uh, on Chinese soil. But again, if it can be avoided, I think it should be avoided. I don't think we need to go nuclear in order to have a massive advantage. And to end the war, we obviously wouldn't want to target the Chinese civilian government because we want the civilian government to be able to surrender. So we're not going to hit uh, Jinping with a cruise missile because we want him to surrender. Okay, but if we take out the civilian government, then the potential for surrender is strongly reduced. So essentially, what I'm saying is, we want them to be able to surrender. So in any war, we shouldn't fight them to a point where it's difficult for central authority to surrender. Um, Another thing worth noting is the potential of boots on the ground. And as I said, if it is a limited war, we might not have to put boots on the ground. It could be a situation like the 19th century British wars in China, where a lot of it happened on the coast. You didn't have to go very far in. Now, China does have at least two major stock exchanges on the coast. You've got Shanghai and Shenzhen. So that's an obvious point of conflict there. Now, in the aftermath, what happens afterwards? What do we do afterwards? Um, what happens to China if we win? Essentially, well, in light of the genocide that has been happening, and again, I'm not saying we go to war for the genocide, even though there's probably a lot of people that would be all in favor of it. I mean, if you want to do propaganda about genocide, you can do that. But in light of the genocide, I think it's fair to give the Chinese uh, regions the option of full independence. So if there's a region in China, let's say Tibet, for example, that wants to be fully independent, they can be fully independent. And then the rest gets united with the Republic of China to form a new Republic of China. And then what we do is the US obviously is going to get a couple of military bases because that's generally how it works. And we might give a military base to Russia to throw them a bone. And then we do a sort of NATO-like alliance network in China to ensure that the various Chinese countries don't invade each other, and to also ensure that Russia and the U.S. Don't invade China again. So in that sense, that's generally how it would be. Uh, the less Chinese portions of China would probably declare independence. Um, some more Chinese portions might choose to be independent. I don't know. There might be an independent Hong Kong, or it might be united with the ROC. I don't know what the people of Hong Kong would want to do there. But generally, the advantage of giving independence to the outlying regions of China is that it reduces the territory and resources of whatever China is resultant from this, which means that the situation that brought us here in the first place, that is China as an emerging power getting larger, uh, is less likely to repeat itself. So essentially, the point is that we want to avoid the situation that got us into this mess in the first place. We want to avoid the Thucydides trap from occurring again. And to do that, we simply create a China that is slightly weaker than the current China, and there you go. Now, tell me what you think. Do you think that this plan is kind of kooky? Do you think that I'm just lying? I'm actually a super hard war hawk, that I'm lying about wanting to avoid most conflicts? Do you think that there's an alternative, a sort of Neville Chamberlain route we could take towards China? Um, Tell me what you think, is what I'm saying in general. Again, I'd like to reiterate, I'm not generally the kind of guy that says we need to go to war here, there, and everywhere. What I am saying is that in very few instances, there are times when we have to go to war. And in a case where we have to go to war, there's already aggression happening on both sides. We might as well do it while we have the advantage. That's what I'm saying. Again, tell me what you think. Do you think that China's provocations are too mild to warrant war? Do you think that the Thucydides trap and this idea of power dynamics leading to inevitable conflict are fake? Do you disagree with that? Just tell me what you think, is what I'm saying. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on Awiltus Over and Out.